Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to anyone who is currently watching this presentation. My name is Colton Schlesinger, and I am very pleased to be able to participate at this year's Coin Conference. To start, I'd like to thank everyone who is viewing this presentation for this year's Coin Conference. I'm grateful to have this opportunity to present to all of you today, and I'd like to welcome you to the presentation of my research titled Advocacy and Opposition, an analysis of Ulysses S. Grant's struggle with religious minorities. This presentation is an adaptation of my undergraduate capstone thesis by the same title. Before I get into the meat of my research, I'd like to offer a little background for why I have chosen to research this particular topic. About 2 years ago, I received advice from one of my university professors that if I wanted to grow as a person, I should read biographies. I took this advice to heart, visited my local bookstore, and purchased the cheapest, densest biography I could find. The volume that I selected was Ron Chernow's Grant. As I began, I realized how similar many of my personal struggles were to those of Grant, and I immediately empathized with him. I finished the near 900-page volume in about 5 months and came out having grown as a person and with a newfound admiration for my 19th century hero. I knew then that I wanted to do my research during my undergraduate years of some aspect of Grant's life. In my search for a topic, I discovered that while many historians tackle Grant's relationship with alcohol, Confederacy, or racial minorities, relatively little attention is paid to the important relationships that Grant had with religious minorities. I decided to investigate here. My own grandfather comes from a long line of Polish Jews. However, I have grown up a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, sometimes referred to as Mormons, for my entire life. I decided to focus my investigation on Grant's relationships with both sides of my own heritage, Latter-day Saints and Jews. Initially, finding primary sources was a challenge, but thanks to the kind direction and advice of Ron Chernow, who I was able to get in contact with, I was able to discover far more than I could have on my own. The primary questions that guided my research were, what was Grant's relationship like with Latter-day Saints and Jews? How were they similar? How were they different? If they were different, why so? And what would explain such a difference in treatment? In order to conduct this research, I consulted with a wide array of primary and secondary sources. Perhaps the most useful primary sources that I used for my research came from the papers of Ulysses S. Grant, volumes 1 through 31. These volumes are available for free electronically through Mississippi State University. I combed meticulously through every volume, scanning each one's bibliography for any references to Jews, Mormons, or associated concerns. I was richly rewarded for this exercise, and what I found became the basis for my research. I was also aided by numerous newspaper articles which provided greater context for specific events enumerated in my paper. Grant's several annual addresses to Congress also contained plenty of useful information. I was also aided by the use of several secondary sources, which provide greater context and commentary for the subject matter of my paper. Of particular importance was Jonathan Sarna's When General Grant Expelled the Jews, which recounts in chronological order and great detail the fascinating flashpoints that characterized Grant's long relationship with the American Jewish community. I also relied on two noteworthy publications of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints for needed historical context. These works are Saints, volumes 1 and 2, which tell in narrative form much of the early history of the Latter-day Saints from their own perspective. These accounts were useful because they provided context for how the Saints in the Utah Territory were viewing the events transpiring not only in their territory, but in Washington as well. Of course, I also relied on Ron Chernow's epic biography, Grant, to help aid with the historical context of Grant's life. I found it useful in the course of my research to employ an annotated bibliography to organize my sources and my thoughts. It's very time consuming as an exercise, but through the use of this bibliography, I was able to keep track of all my work, notes, and ideas. After much research, I came to several conclusions that are the basis for my paper's thesis. In my paper, I argue that while Grant's attitude towards Jews and Latter-day Saints can often be described as combative and antagonistic, in the end, Grant was far more sympathetic to American Jews as a whole than he was towards the Latter-day Saints of Utah. Indeed, Grant made several early missteps in his relationship with the American Jewish community. However, he would spend much of his later career and life attempting to right his previous wrongs and make atonement for his past mistakes. With Latter-day Saints, however, Grant was far less penitent. In Grant, the Latter-day Saints found a constant oppressor. Through a two-pronged campaign, which consisted of direct legislative salvos and hardline judicial appointments, Grant attempted to undermine the Latter-day Saints, which he viewed as an upstart mountain theocracy in the making. Grant's opposition to Latter-day Saints primarily lay in their refusal to accept federal authority in the Utah Territory and through their insistence on maintaining polygamy as a social institution. In this way, it is probable that Grant viewed Latter-day Saints as a new confederacy in the making and attempted to use his presidential powers to disempower the church. Ultimately, American Judaism prospered under the Grant administration, while Latter-day Saints institutions nearly crumbled under the presidential onslaught. Now, the root of Grant's problems with both the Jewish community and Latter-day Saints was a fundamental lack of understanding, born out of either an unwillingness or an inability to relate to these religious minorities. My paper is organized around this thesis and divided into three distinct sections. First, Grant and the Jewish community. Second, Grant and Latter-day Saints. And third, understanding Grant. I would like to speak briefly to each of these sections and describe my focus and use of evidence. In my first section, I discuss Grant's relationship with the American Jewish community. The primary flashpoints of this relationship that I address in my paper are General Order Number 11, the election of 1868, and Grant's presidential atonement. The first of these flashpoints is known as General Order Number 11, which was a military order that Grant authorized while a general in the Civil War in the Western Theater of Kentucky. Issued on December 17, 1862, Grant said, quote, "The Jews as a class, violating every regulation of trade established by the Treasury Department and also department orders, are hereby expelled from the department." Within 24 hours from the receipt of this order by post commanders, they will see that all of this class of people are furnished with passes and required to leave. And anyone returning after such notification will be arrested, end quote. Resulting from a desire to curb northern carpetbagging in the South, this prejudiced order was ultimately revoked by Grant's superiors, General Henry Halleck and Abraham Lincoln. But it created lasting tension between Grant and the American Jewish community. During the election of 1868, when Grant was nominated for president on the Republican ticket, many Jews found themselves at a loss for who to vote. Many supported the Republican Party, but had a hard time voting for a candidate that they believed was an anti-Semite. Through several interactions with members of the Jewish community, Grant was able to smooth things over with the Jews, reassuring them that the order had less to do with religious or ethnic persecution than it did with the wartime strategic concerns of the North. This pacified many Jews, so much so, apparently, that a prominent American Jew by the name of Liebman Adler wrote in an article that was subsequently published in various newspapers, quote, "If that party in whose hands I believe the welfare of the country was safest were to place a Haman at the helm of state, and if the opposite party were to place the Messiah at their head, make Moses the Chief Justice and the patriarchs to the cabinet, I should say, speaking of the former party of Haman, you have my vote." End quote. Over the course of his administration, and the rest of his life for that matter, President Grant sought to atone for his past mistakes and missteps with the American Jewish community. He made a record number of Jewish appointments to public office, governorships, ambassadorships, and official posts. He was charitable and sympathetic to American Jews, as well as Jews all over the country. He became invested in the plight of the persecution of international Jews across the world, and as well as concerns of Jews in the domestic area, things that were important to them. As historian Jonathan Sarna expertly records in his book, when General Grant expelled the Jews, he said, in his words, quote, "The transformation of Ulysses S. Grant from enemy to friend, from Haman to Mordecai, reminds us that even great figures in history can learn from their mistakes," end quote. Now, unlike the Jews, however, the Latter-day Saints did not receive such favorable treatment. This has to do with Grant's opposition to two elements that Grant despised in the Latter-day Saints: their anti-federal theocracy and their practice of polygamy. Grant attempted to undermine what he viewed as Latter-day Saint recalcitrance through the use of legislative pushes and judicial appointments. According to the Republican Party platform of 1856, polygamy, then practiced by the Latter-day Saints, and slavery were two, quote, relics of barbarism that deserved to be extinguished from American society. Throughout his presidency, Grant made numerous calls and advances for harsher polygamy legislation that could bring Latter-day Saints into line. In one of his annual addresses to Congress, President Grant said, quote, "In Utah, there still remains a remnant of barbarism, repugnant to civilization, to decency, and to the laws of the United States. Territorial officers, however, have been found who are willing to perform their duty in a spirit of equity and with a due sense of necessity of sustaining the majesty of the law. Neither polygamy nor any other violation of existing statutes will be permitted within the territory of the United States. It is not with the religion of the self-styled saints that we are now dealing, but with their practices. They will be protected in the worship of God according to the dictates of their own consciences, but they will not be permitted to violate the laws under the cloak of religion." End quote. In addition to legislative action, Grant attempted to install territorial judicial officers sympathetic to federal control who would impose federal rule over the Latter-day Saints of Utah. Over time, these efforts gradually wore on the Latter-day Saints to the point that polygamy was ultimately abandoned in order to protect the church from legal dismemberment. A good portion of my paper considers the Latter-day Saint perspective of this contentious relationship. It is clear from Grant's correspondence with his subordinates that many of them were seemingly ignorant or unknowing of the events that had transpired between the saints and the federal government, as well as many state governments, in the past 50 years. In their accounts, the saints describe great privations and neglect, mistreatment and persecution on the part of the government. The saints tended to see themselves as having been forced out of the United States for their beliefs. They resented the federal government for not protecting them when their property was destroyed, their wives and women and children abused, and their people at sometimes massacred. Having left the country, they continued to feel the hard hand of government, as numerous presidential administrations attempted to exert force on them from Washington. During the presidency of James Buchanan, the federal government all but declared war on the Latter day Saints. This perspective was never addressed by Grant, nor did he show any indication of attempting to understand this perspective. Additionally, Latter day Saints held a different moral stance on polygamy than was found throughout the country. For them, they saw polygamy as part of the free exercise clause of the First Amendment, an inalienable right. To the Saints, the federal attacks on polygamy tantamounted to a revocation of the hard won liberties many of their ancestors had died fighting for during the American Revolution. Additionally, many Latter day Saint women saw polygamy as liberating and ennobling. There are numerous records of prominent Latter day Saint women holding rallies, indignation meetings, and even writing Grant and his wife on this subject. In some cases in the Utah Territory, the ratio of men to women was less than 1-to-1, meaning fewer men per the population of women. So women often saw polygamy as an opportunity to enter into family relationships which they would otherwise be denied. With fewer men, that meant there could be fewer monogamous marriages, and more women would find themselves single without the opportunity to marry. Likewise, they saw federal opposition to polygamy as an infringement on their right to choose their own spouse. Polygamy was not, in their view, a relic of barbarism akin to slavery, but rather an opportunity and a blessing. These views, however, did not impact the general perception of polygamy in the United States as a whole, nor to Grant personally. Unfortunately, Grant was never able to make the same kind of atonement and reconciliation with Latter day Saints that he had made and characterized his relationship with the American Jewish community. One important reason that Grant failed to have the same success with Latter day Saints as he did with Jews is that he fundamentally failed to understand Latter day Saints the way he had come to understand Jews. He did not visit Latter day Saints frequently, interact with them often, and deliberated with them seldom, if at all. In contrast with his efforts with American Jews, Grant made almost no effort to actually understand the complex cultural, historical, and emotional vectors that made the saints react and act in the manner that they did. A careful study of Latter day Saint dialogue and correspondence of the day suggests that the saints were quite sympathetic to constitutional government and federal authority. However, they believed that the federal government had trampled their First Amendment rights as enumerated in the Free Exercise Clause. This fundamental lack of understanding and, frankly, lack of communication inhibited Grant from making meaningful progress with the saints. Additionally, I argue in my paper that Grant may have seen in the saints a new confederacy in the making. Like the Confederacy, the saints employed one of the relics of barbarism as a social institution, the South with slavery, and Latter-day Saints with polygamy. And like the Confederacy, Latter-day Saints resisted federal authority across a broad geographical region in ways that often could lead to violence. This would explain why Grant took a similar bulldogish approach to the Saints as he did to Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. A strategy once employed and proved successful was often tried again by General Grant in the war, and could explain why a strategy used by General Grant to win the war was the subject of his civilian efforts against the Latter-day Saints. Now, this historical comparison between Ulysses S. Grant's treatment of the Jews and Latter-day Saints illustrates the difficulties that American presidents face when presiding over a pluralistic society. But it also suggests a path forward for America's current and future presidents, as well as for other concerned leaders of pluralistic societies. What Grant's experience teaches is that while no president or elected official will be perfect in their execution of justice and equity, serious efforts towards reconciliation can be made by understanding those who are perceived to be enemies. At times, Grant attempted to take a politically aggressive approach, as shown in General Order 11 and in various episodes with the Latter-day Saints. This method was usually ineffective. The approach Grant used to defeat a belligerent Confederacy is not apt for the tough domestic questions that minority groups pose. What will work, as shown in Grant's later relationship with the Jewish community, is an ability and a willingness to hear, understand, and respond appropriately to the concerns of minority groups. Grant's experience with Latter-day Saints and Jews is still relevant today. It suggests that the way to achieve better domestic harmony is not in political warmongering, but rather in more serious efforts to hear, understand, and reconcile with minority groups that one does not understand and perhaps with whom they disagree. Grant was able to reconcile with the American Jews because he took the time to hear, appreciate, and act on their concerns. Unfortunately, Grant was not able to emulate this same success with Latter-day Saints, in part because he did not follow the same method that he had employed with the Jewish community. But future presidents and leaders can learn from Grant's mistakes by hearing, seeing, and understanding, or at least attempting to understand, those with whom they disagree. Modern presidents stand a far better chance of ensuring the domestic tranquility that the Constitution was created to protect. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Thank you again for listening. Your support is appreciated.